Well, this looks like another Confessions podcast from your friends at Radio 2, and it's been a very sin-filled week, as you might imagine. This week's Concise Collation includes a binload of blue-veined Brie, a confession you're going to remember, some strains, pains and gains, but no rain in Spain, one of the longest confessions we've ever done. It's epic. A hefty hose down and a delightful dog's dinner, all coming up. Who are you going to forgive? Here it all comes. This is a sort of a Christmas confession, but there's a hint of Christmas about it. And, of course, it just makes me think, if you have a Christmas... And there always are either Father Christmas or Christmas presents or Christmas turkeys or whatever, mince pies. There's loads and loads of Christmas confessions. Now is the time to get them in. Confessions at bbc.co.uk. It's just a hint of it with this one, which seems appropriate on December 2. This is from Eddie. Thank you, Eddie, dear Father Sam, the most caring collective. Some 10 years or so ago, I was working in an office on Borough High Street in London. The office was a bit grim, but it had the advantage of being next to the marvellous Borough Market, packed with food and drink of all kinds from all over the world. The problem was that the food was so tempting, the pounds piled on. This confession takes place in the run-up to one Christmas, when I popped into the Market Porter, a real ale pub famed for opening at 5 a.m, to help the market porters quench their thirst after their early morning shift. A couple of dark ales slipped down nicely, and then it was over to the market for a mouth-watering delicious cheese toasty to see me through my train journey back to Colchester. It being close to Christmas, I decided a treat was in order. Another one, so bought a couple of bottles of bottle-conditioned stout from the market for myself, and went to a cheese stall to get something for my wife. Now, she's partial to a bit of blue vein, so I chose a crusted French blue vein Brie. I selected it carefully. I wanted it ready to eat that night, so it had to be just on the verge of getting soft, not the kind of rock-solid Brie you get from the supermarkets that takes a month to ripen. Are we all together on this? You got the picture? Yeah, okay. So onto the train at Liverpool Street. First stop, Colchester. After an hour, destination Norwich, a further hour later. I got on the train, put the bottles on the table in front of me, and the plastic bag with the blue vein Brie went under the seat, out of harm's way. The train got crowded, and as we pulled out of Liverpool Street, the heating clicked on. Oh, no. Now, the heating on these trains has two settings, off and nuclear. And I realised as hot gusts of dust and air blew around my ankles, the heating on those carriages came from floor-level grills, and my cheese was under the seat next to a grill. I tried to get a hold of the plastic bag with the cheese in it, but realised that in putting it under the chair, I had swung it right out of reach. Plus, it had started to seep out of the bag and onto what was loosely called a carpet. I decided I would have to wait until the train stopped at Colchester to retrieve it, picturing the unedifying sight of an overweight man in his 40s on his hands and knees on a dirty train floor, scraping and scrabbling for a plastic bag. Not good. As we passed through Stratford, I realised with a dawning horror that there was a definite smell of ripening blue cheese pervading the carriage. Some minutes later, going through Shenfield, quite a few fellow travellers had become aware of the aroma. Further on, going through Chelmsford, as I recall, the smell had stopped being whiffy and started being quite pungent. Passengers were muttering and looking around to spot the source. I decided, to my shame, I was going to play the innocent. We went through Witham, and the cheese was now offensively pungent. Closing in on Colchester, was it my imagination or were my eyes watering? People were looking behind the seats, under the seats, on their shoes, on luggage racks, but my cheese was so well hidden it was never going to be found. An old lady started retching and fanning herself vigorously. As I got off at Colchester, I opened the door of the train, and the passengers on the platform, waiting to get on the train, took a step backwards as the fetid stench from the carriage washed over them. They decided to enter the train by another carriage. I walked home, conscious that my clothes may have been imbued with the blue cheese aroma and wanting to air them. I confessed all to my wife when I got home. I confessed that whilst I had had all my beers, there was to be no blue vein for her tonight. And so, Simon, I need to beg forgiveness from my fellow travellers, from those who endured another 20 minutes to Ipswich, forgiveness from those who endured a further 20 minutes to Stowmarket, and forgiveness from those poor souls for whom Norwich was a further 20 minutes after that. I fear for the old lady. I'm not sure if a soft cheese can knock you out, but this one was definitely going to give it a good go. And finally, I beg forgiveness from the cleaners who must have found what amounted to a baked puddle of Brie underneath my seat, a collapsed mess of fromage that had once been a beautiful round Brie, and doubtless it had to be scraped off the floor too. Yours, a humble penitent, called Eddie. Anyway, I know why he sent that one in. Anyway, because it's the beginning of Christmas, and that's why he sent it in. Anyway, let's see what we make of that.
What a fantastic confession. That reminds me of those people who try and get back at their partners when they split up by stuffing, old fish in the curtain poles and putting them back up, and the partner never knows what the source of the smell is.
There are quite a few of those, but I haven't had one of these.
Just perfectly hidden ripe blue cheese. I mean, it's the perfect crime, isn't it? But it wasn't intended. That's the point, I guess. And he also lost his wife's lovely blue cheese, so he's already had his comeuppance in a way.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind would have been able to get down on their hands and knees and remove the cheese after so many people had commented on the smell. So I think it's completely understandable, and you're forgiven, Eddie.
Yes, I'm not going to forgive Eddie, but anyway, what do you say? What do you say, Matthew?
I love the attention to detail in this story.
I only noticed one of the details as I went through it.
Did you really? Yes. No, I love that one.
I didn't notice anything.
Good. We're not going to talk about that. Stratford, Shenfield, Witham. Excellent. Well, let's name all the station stops.
It was absolutely getting worse.
I'm not the biggest fan of cheese, and this tells me that I've been right all along in not liking cheese, because it does stink, and everyone had to smell his cheese on the train. So for that reason, I am going to forgive, because he probably will never buy that particular brand of cheese again.
It does sound as though you put a lot of effort into finding some crusted French blue vein Brie for his wife. It was, so it was nicely thought out.
Yes, it was.
Never reached its final, ended up on the
too
carpet.
smelly.
I think I've been on one of those trains as well.
Yeah.
And he's right about the heaters. We tried to crowbar this one in for the last sort of week or so. Viva España is what we've been calling it. And it's found it difficult to find a way in just because it's slightly longer than normal. So some of the best confessions are like scenes from a sitcom. This is like an entire sitcom. So not half an hour's worth, but, in a few minutes. This one is from Sam, who sends in tonight's tale. Father Simon in the assembled assembly. My confession goes back to 1971 and has weighed heavy on my heart since the day I accidentally learnt my first words in Spanish. So, Father Simon, be prepared for your unique skills in accents. Always a challenging moment. And your Spanish accent, of course, Matt, will you have to sit in judgment?
This is going to be,
August the 1st was a special day in the lives of every boy between the ages of 5 and 55. For August the 1st was the day every year that the new car registration plates were released. In 1971, the new reg plate was K. I ran home from playing out that day with an extra spring in my step, for this was the day that my dad was presenting to us, his family, his new company car. On the very day that the registration plate came out. A massive day for every boy in the era. I have never been more proud when, surrounded by bullying school friends who were waiting for the ultimate fail, my dad proudly delivered to our house a beautiful K-Reg red Hillman Hunter estate car. It was the newest, shiniest, longest and reddest car on our estate, and it put every other car there to shame, what with their D-Reg Ford Anglias and their F-Reg Triumph Heralds. I don't think so. My dad had the newest car on the estate, and for about 20 minutes I was the proudest 7-year-old in the neighbourhood. I say 20 minutes because that is roughly the amount of time it took me to destroy everything connected to that car. The car my dad was so proud to show off to my mum, the car that the neighbours were so keen to stroke and sit in, and add comments and suggestions to my dad as to how he should take it on the proposed trip to the Algarve, which was our summer holiday that year. Father Simon, in those days, a trip to the Algarve was a road trip of epic proportions, which started with a sea passage from Plymouth to Bilbao. So 20 minutes into ownership of the pride of my estate, my dad decided that before the following day's trip to Portugal, he should carry out James May-esque pre-flight checks with me, his willing 7-year-old assistant, now proudly promoted to chief engineer. Together in a father and son moment, the likes of which we never shared before or since, we opened the bonnet to see where the water and oil went. We even jacked the car up so we knew where the jacking points were and how to operate the jack in the event of a flat tyre type emergency. My dad checked that the Hillman Hunter's jack worked perfectly, which it did, and then gave me the important job of putting everything back, whilst he went for a well-deserved bacon butty. Everything went back perfectly into the Hillman Hunter's craftily designed spare wheel space, everything except for the jack. No matter how I positioned the jack into the storage area, I could not get the thing to fit back into its space and then fit the cardboard and carpet over the Hillman's ample rear storage space. The jack just seemed to be too long to fit. If only I could make the jack shorter somehow. But as a 7-year-old chief engineer, I lacked the strength and or the mechanical experience to wind the jack down completely. In desperation to please my dad, I took a lump hammer to the jack.
Oh, yes.
Always good. And hammered it enough to fit into the place where it was originally designed to fit, obviously completely ruining the jack's winding thread in the process. But hey, it now fitted, and as the old saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. The following afternoon, then, we embarked on our epic trip to the Algarve. There was Dad driving, Mum navigating, Grandma sat behind Mum, my 8-year-old brother, me, age 7, my little brother, age 3, and my littlest baby brother, who was just 5 months old, who occupied a carry cot in the Hillman's spacious luggage area behind the rear seat. With 2 roof racks on, the Hillman Hunter, we set off for Plymouth. How can you have 2? Eventually, we boarded our car ferry for Spain via the notorious Bay of Biscay. The crossing was not smooth. In fact, we all suffered from seasickness, especially my baby brother, who was violently ill all the way to Spain, where we thankfully disembarked 18 hours later. Heading through Spain was a long, painful affair. Adults suffering from seasickness, kids whinging about, are we there yet? And my little brother's nappies being filled and stinking the car out on a half-hourly basis. It could not have been worse. Until... bang! Rumble, rumble, rumble. A flat rear tyre on the Hillman. My dad summoned me, the chief engineer, and we put into action our well-rehearsed plan of the day before, with a few differences. My dad placed the jack under the jacking point and attempted to raise the car. He muttered something under his breath. He examined the jack. He broke down in tears at the side of the road in the middle of this Spanish desert. And then the shouting started. My mum accused him of not checking the jack, him adamant that he did, me silent, my brothers asking if we were there yet, my baby brother producing yet more nappy material, my grandma asking if she could help, my dad losing his temper. Well, we were stumped. The trip had come to a halt. There was nobody around in this Spanish wasteland and no cars had passed in hours. Surely we were going to die.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it would be a first.
Yeah.
Actually, it wouldn't, but anyway, that's another story. In the middle of this catastrophe, my mother gave me a special job of disposing of the latest offering from my baby brother. I missed that bit out. My mother suggested that I find the biggest rock that I could and bury the offending nappy under it. I wandered off the road with the nuclear waste held at arm's length, looking for a big rock. I found such a rock, so heavy it took me 5 minutes to roll it out of the position that it had rested in since the last ice age. I stuck the nuclear waste under it and then I rolled it back into position. Nappy duly hidden, I returned to try and console my father, who was by now swinging the jack above his head and smashing it against the road, eventually flinging the offending jack into a nearby field. And then a miracle happened. Out of the haze came about 6 Guardia civil officers on motorbikes. I was instantly impressed by the gleaming bikes, the shiny leather boots, the pistols, the tight pantaloons, the moustaches. These were the pride of General Franco's elite military police. Here was help. We might not die after all. One Guardia civil junior officer was obviously a family man. He smiled at us, flirted with my mother, and kissed my grandma's hand. I liked him. In my mind, he was my hero. The captain barked instructions to the junior officers, some of which I could understand. Inglés was one word I understood. Well, actually, that was it. They explained something to my dad using hand gestures, and he announced that to get us out of the car, the nice policemen were going to lift the car up by hand whilst he changed the tyre. Well, we bailed out. They lifted the car by hand. My dad tried to remove the flat tyre, and then the coppers dropped the car before we could get the wheel off. The Hillman Hunter was not, I should remind you, a light car, especially with 2 roof racks on and Granny still inside.
Get out the car!
The policeman then had a rethink, and the captain came up with possibly the best idea he had ever had, but also possibly the worst idea as far as my Guardia Civil junior officer was concerned. The captain turned to Miguel, for that is what I had secretly called him, and gave him an instruction. Although I couldn't speak a word of Spanish, being only 7, I understood with dread every word that was being said. It was, in a Spanish accent now, Simon, Miguel, go and find the biggest rock you can and bring it here so we can put it under the car. He's slightly Russian, Miguel.
Extraordinary accent.
Under the car next time we lift it. I gave up in the end.
Yeah.
He's got to go and get a rock.
Yeah.
I wanted to stop it happening. I wanted to warn, I really, really wanted to warn everybody precisely what was going to happen. But I wanted to warn Miguel the most. I was rooted to the spot. Miguel headed off in the direction I'd returned from 20 minutes previously, and returned with my rock, held securely in both arms against his stomach, and unbeknownst to Miguel, my baby brother's nappy attached to it, gently flapping against his crisply ironed green pantaloons, ceremoniously releasing green goo all down his beautiful black leather boots. He only realised that he was covered in what I now believe the Spanish to be called caca, when he had placed the rock under the car that his colleagues had lifted. As his colleagues covered their noses and pointed at Miguel in a mocking way, I then learnt some more words in Spanish, which I've since discovered are not repeatable in a religious setting such as this. The tyre was eventually changed successfully, albeit with looks that could kill, from Miguel, and we rapidly continued our journey without incident. As we set off from that hell, waving to the nice policeman through the rear window, heated on the Hillman, you know, I felt remorse at seeing Miguel attempt to wipe off my baby brother's offerings from his beautiful boots. I'd like to beg forgiveness for my negligence as chief engineer on this trip when I maliciously destroyed the jack, and for my negligence in not finding a bigger rock under which to hide my baby brother's nappy, and for my negligence in not warning Miguel of the existence of toxic, luminous goo on the nappy attached to my rock. With greatest remorse, that's Sam who sends in tonight's tale. Well, so we have the first time General Franco has had a mention in any confession, so for that reason. And it ties in nicely with your nappy story in the next hour. It does,
yes. That sounds like a scene from my life, I have to say, with, nappies and poo and people shouting and chaos and pantaloons. Yes, exactly. I think nobody in their right mind would have admitted to having put the nappy there. You would just pretend it was somebody else's nappy, wouldn't you? Even if that place had never been, a human hadn't set foot in that place for days or months. I think the father was a little bit responsible for having left his 7-year-old in charge as chief engineer to put all the parts back in the boot of the car. And the idea of the 7-year-old with a lump hammer and a jack is, in these days of health and safety, is, it's a bit alarming, really. So I think the father's got some responsibility here. So I don't blame Sam at all. Sam, you're completely forgiven.
OK, that's one vote. What do we think?
That was an outstanding story. That was really funny. I agree with Rebecca about this. What's this father doing, leaving his son to sort out everything with it when he's 7? And I love the idea that he's there having his tea and little Sam goes past with a lump hammer. Where's Sam going? Where's our 7-year-old going with the lump hammer? And also I think everyone listening to this story now is going, do you know what, just before we go out in the car tonight, let's make sure we've got the jack and make sure that it works, because I don't want that happening to me. So I'm definitely going to forgive, because it was very funny, and it's obviously the dad's fault anyway.
This is a confession from Will, who sends in tonight's tale. Yours, please, to confessions@bbc.co.uk. Don't forget the podcast is there for you to sign up to, and you can have the whole thing downloaded in one chunk. Father Simon and the Ecclesiastical Collective. I've been inspired to at last confess my sins after hearing the recent confession about a couple of excellent farm lads on a tractor and the trailer and the load of hay in the open-top BMW.
Oh, yes.
Remember that?
I do.
Yeah.
Which is fun. As you will see, my confession goes a stage further. To set the scene, I run a small business in Wales which specialises in landscape and sports ground contracting. A good few years ago, I was fortunate enough to be awarded a contract by a council to renew 2 of their bowling greens. The first bowling green involved the removal of the old and worn-out artificial surface and replacing it with a high-spec grass surface, along with new surrounds and an automatic irrigation system. Work duly commenced, and all went well. The new surface was completed with laser accuracy, and a special pre-germinated grass seed was sprayed on. Now, this seed speeds up the whole process considerably, but it does need watering regularly, which is where the automatic irrigation system comes into play. Some of you might be imagining that this is something like your average garden sprinkler. Well, think again. Imagine 4 firemen's hoses, one in the centre of each side, which will pop out of the footpath and spray vast amounts of water, swinging through a beautiful 180-degree arc as they do so. Now, all this is going to be...
I think we know what's coming here.
I think we probably do. Now, all this equipment takes a lot of setting up, not least to ensure that each of the sprinkler heads is adjusted to start and stop in exactly the right place. Having done all this, we left the site to carry on work on the second bowling green in the sure knowledge that when enough water had been sprayed on, the system would automatically shut down. Now, whilst we were gone, a strong wind got up. And along one side of the bowling green was a road and a line of parked cars, one of which was an open-top Mercedes. Well, you can guess the next bit. Yes, the sprinkler system and the strong winds managed to combine to put a foot of water inside the car. Having returned to the site and discovered what had taken place, and being devout cowards, the sprinklers were turned off and we hurried home. We never heard any more about the incident, so I can only assume that the owner had returned completely mystified as to what had happened. He probably cursed the local kids. Well, it wasn't them, it was me. Now, all this might be bad enough, but this is not the end of the story. There was, after all, a second bowling green and a second irrigation system. All went well with works to the second green, which was duly completed a few weeks later. After a suitable period of time to allow the new grass to establish, it was agreed by me and the council official responsible for parks and leisure activities that the green could now host its opening match, which was arranged for a few days later. Everything was set. Let me tell you now what eyewitnesses report. The following series of events took place. The local old boys turned up in their immaculate whites, the visiting team of gentlemen replete with blazers and caps. The game began. The concentration was intense. Pipes were puffed fiercely, crouching, throwing, gentle running, polite applause. And then the sprinklers popped up. Father Simon, I have to tell you, it was like the poll tax riots all over again. With my sprinklers playing the role of the police and the gentlemen bowlers playing the part of the anarchists/demonstrators. What we hadn't remembered to do was to change the irrigation settings from mid-afternoon to later in the evening, and from light sprinkle to tidal wave. The first hose took half of the players, hosing them from behind. The other power nozzles sprayed the rest of them, their whites turning instantly see-through. There was much scrambling, slipping and cursing as the two teams moved as swiftly as they could, which, let's be honest, wasn't that swift anyway, away from the water. Riot police couldn't have used their hoses more effectively. The impact of a few tumbles and falls on my lawn, however, meant that all play had to be suspended for a few more days. I don't think anyone's that bothered about your lawn by now, Will. Well, I don't ask forgiveness from the Mercedes driver, as leaving a flash car with the hood down is asking for trouble. But I do ask forgiveness for soaking all those poor old folk and for ruining their match of bowls. For such terrible crime, I can only expect to incur the wrath of all and be condemned to an eternal hell of adjusting irrigation systems. Will, who needs a little bit of... he's done his repenting and he'd like some forgiveness. I think that would have been an interesting match. Another kind of Dad's Army moment there with the bowling match turning into a poll tax riot. What do you think?
I like
Sister
his
Rebecca?
description of the people on the bowling lawn and the poll tax riot. The juxtaposition of those two images is very good. I think, he forgot to change the settings. So obviously, it was a complete accident, wasn't it? On the other hand, if you do that kind of thing for a living, that should just be par for the course, shouldn't it? So given that, I don't mind about the Mercedes either, but I do think it's a bit much for the people in their lovely whites getting soaked. I can't forgive you.
Not forgiven. OK, let's see what Brother...
Right, on the first count, anyone who parks their convertible car, in fact, anyone who has a convertible car, I think we've already established, is getting no
class
sympathy.
War again, is
yes,
it
is. It's definitely class war. On the second count, I think there must be some kind of design flaw in this. In these hoses and the irrigation system, if they're just going to turn on willy-nilly and there doesn't appear to be any override. So I'm going to say he has done nothing wrong here. It's entirely down to the hoses, and always good to get it.
It's the hoses' fault.
It's the hoses' fault. And so yes, and great to get a poll tax reference in there as well. Yes. Well done, everyone. Yes, I'm going to forgive.
So it's a Foodie Thursday, and Nigel is in early because he's the novice, and he turns up in our collective. And there's a little bit of food that turns up in this tale, I have to tell you. It's from Tim. Thank you, Tim, for this confession for today. Dear Father Simon, the Understanding Collective, I've carried my burden for some time now, as this goes back to my being a frugal final-year student in Durham in the early 90s. At the time, I was sharing a flat with 5 other students. Don't worry, Matt, no art students here, says...
Oh, good.
No berets in this confession. Like many others, university was the first time that I effectively had to fend for myself, meaning that I had to cook if I wanted to eat. Typically, the everyday requirements for basic provisions would be met by the campus shop, but this needed to be supplemented by a visit to stock up on supplies at a supermarket in the city centre every few weeks. My mum had given me a short list of recipes to make, and after having used them for a few months, I felt adventurous enough to make some changes. To be fair, despite the best will in the world, I was getting a bit bored of cooking and hit upon the great idea of freezing a big pot of tomato-based sauce and adding any necessary herbs or spices to give my meals a bit of variety. I'm sure you can imagine. I had curry powder for curry and chili powder for chilies. You can tell this guy is pretty inspired when it comes to mixing up the different fruit and food varieties. This allowed me, Father Simon, to prepare several portions at once, which would then be stored in the small freezer in the kitchen and individually thawed out over the course of about a week as required. This worked quite well for a while, but as the term went on, money became a bit tighter. I'm not entirely sure this is unrelated to the close proximity of the student bar. Anyway, my next trip to the supermarket in the city, I scoured the aisles for all the best deals. Was having difficulty fulfilling the meat requirement for my big pot of sauce. All of the fresh meat was so expensive. However, in the trolley of another customer, I spotted a bag of the supermarket's own brand frozen mince. I hadn't seen this before. I went to the frozen food aisle to investigate and found the same bag, and as it was a fraction of the cost of the fresh mince, I was quids in. I quickly made all the necessary purchases and caught the bus back to the flat to make a bumper pot of base sauce. I have to tell you, there was so much mince. I had to take some of the precious freezer space with half the bag, but this gave me nearly enough food for a fortnight of dinners. As Nigel will tell you, says Tim, all good chefs should taste their food.
Oh, yes, as you go along. Absolutely key.
There you go, that's precisely what he says. And after the sauce had been cooking for a while, I dipped a spoon in to see how it was. While the flavour was as I expected, there was a definite gritty component to the small mouthful which I took. I tried another, exactly the same result. I got some mates to taste it. They said the same. In fact, they then started to spit out small amounts on the floor.
Oh, dear.
Some of these bits were larger than others. This confused me a bit, so I spread a small spoonful on a plate and was shocked to see what appeared to be like bone fragments and other indescribables in the sauce. Well, I have to tell you, I was pretty irate. This had cost me not only all my time, but all the other ingredients. Big pot of sauce, what a waste! I would have to stump up the bus fare to go back and complain. Full of righteous indignation, I kept a portion of the sauce aside, disposed of the rest, and made plans to visit the supermarket with the sauce and the remaining frozen meat, where the bone fragments had obviously come from, when my lectures next allowed. I think it was a day or so before I got back to the supermarket, and I asked, with some crossness, to speak to someone from the butcher's department. "You'll want the butcher's department, then," came the answer.
Yeah.
And so I did. By chance, the head butcher was there at one of the checkouts. I didn't have long to wait to vent my spleen, appropriate phrase, explaining how much this had cost me and what I had lost. He agreed that there shouldn't be any bone in mince, and he could see it in the cooked sample, and that I'd taken along as evidence. He couldn't understand how this had happened, and asked to see the mince that I had bought. I handed over the slightly thawed bag. He opened it out, and this is where my world fell away. While in my efforts to save money, I had noticed a bag of frozen mince in my fellow customer's trolley. I hadn't actually read the whole label, which actually said, "Frozen mince for dogs only."
Oh.
And it was only at this point that I did.
Dear.
"That's frozen mince for dogs, mate," he said. "You get all sorts in that. Bone, skin, heads, flesh, all that."
Oh, lovely.
Well, I was revolted. To be fair to the butcher, he didn't laugh in my face. I think that probably came later. But I remain adamant that at his tea break a few weeks later, he'd have started it with something like, "I had a really thick student in the other day who was complaining about eating dog food." Anyway, I need forgiveness from the butcher for doubting him. I have no evidence to suggest that he did in fact spill the beans, but I have now come to terms with my own stupidity. I need to seek forgiveness from my mates who ate the dog food with the heads and the skin and the bones, and all those who came to dinner who may now wonder what my financial situation is before accepting any further invitations that I might give. Tim, well, that's interesting stuff about frozen mince for dog food. Let's see what Sister Rebecca thinks.
Yeah, I think he was a bit hasty, wasn't he, in choosing his mince. He didn't actually shout at the butcher, did he? He just, he just said, "Look, what's going on?" And so, I mean, if he'd been really obnoxious, I think I would have been more inclined not to forgive him. But anyway, so I know he gave it to his friends, but some people like eating those bits, don't they?
What, dog
it's
food?
very in fashionable restaurants, sort of bones and heads and things like that. A bit of gristle.
Really?
No,
I think it's the fact that it's ground up bones, which just taste like bits of glass or stone or something, as opposed to marrowbone or something like that. I mean,
it's not actually bad for you, though, is it?
Well, it wouldn't do a lot of good. I mean, dogs, they break up bones, but they've got to be raw. You should never go cook bones to animals, certainly dogs.
Okay,
so.
in that case, I'm still going to forgive.
In that case, still going to forgive.
In that case, yeah.
Novice Nigel.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely applaud you, Tim. In fact, that he was trying to make these dishes with tomato base, being frugal, but also quite good ingredients by the sounds of it, and for a week or two in advance. I thought that was really much to be saluted. So the fact that he just got the wrong mince and he didn't shout at anyone.
It's be on the label, frozen mince for dogs only.
He didn't see that, though, did he?
No, he didn't.
Yeah, no. So that was the point. So he was a bit hasty and thought he was onto a good deal. But I certainly forgive him. And by the way, there's a very good website called Beyond Baked Beans, which is aimed at students for life beyond, where you can go and cook and learn how to cook and survive.
Brother Matthew.
Well, here's the thing, and it's intriguing that Nigel's brought that up at the end, because I remember being a student and I trying
Dog
to save
food
money.
was a good night out for you, wasn't it?
It was.
Cat food's even better, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, they're more picky.
I remember living off toast for like
Years?
4 weeks. Until I think my body just gave up. So I can absolutely see why someone would buy really, really cheap mince and try not to think too much about what's actually in the mince. So I'm going to forgive for that. And also, the butcher had a good laugh about it as well, though not in his face, apparently.
Apparently not. 4 memorable confessions, I think. Who did you forgive? But most importantly, send us yours. If you've got a festive one, a little Christmas confession, we'd like that too. confessions@bbc.co.uk. More undoings next week. Don't forget the weekly download of the Weekly Mayo. It's available now and every Thursday. Thank you.